Welcome to the On the Edge podcast with your host, Scott Groves. All right, ladies and gentlemen, it's Scott Groves here with the On the Edge podcast. We got a returning guest. I think this is our most attended guest, Robbie, with his fourth appearance because his book that we've been talking about for 2 years finally came out. It's called Rescuing the American Project, How Nationalism and Immigration Will Revive the Republic. And you're going to hear some interesting takes on what's going on geopolitically. We're recording this show in March of 2025. So a lot going on in the first 60 days of Trump's presidency. Lots going on with immigration, lots going on with people losing their mind one way or the other. So why don't we start here? Because you and your partner Nathan wrote this book, Rescuing the American Project, How Nationalism and Immigration Will Revive the Republic, the American Republic. Why don't we start with what do Republicans get wrong and what do Democrats get wrong when it comes to immigration? And I'll just let you talk for 3 hours.
So, it's really interesting because we started writing this 5 years ago, and I feel like what we started writing has really come into focus with some of those partisan fights. And as Nathan and I both have full-time jobs. And so the book just kept dragging on and dragging on and dragging on. And everything that would come up, we'd be like, oh man, we're missing, this is the moment for the book. And then it just felt like it kept becoming more the moment for the book. So I'll start with what Democrats get wrong. That's been kind of going on for quite a while. I think since basically Bill Clinton with NAFTA and with kind of abandoning labor, the Democrats still had that reputation for being for labor, but really all the moves that they had been doing Clinton and on were cozying up to banks, cozying up to the financial industry, cozying up to open borders policies. And, people who weren't paying attention back that time or weren't alive, it might seem weird to them to know that the Democrats were very much restrictionist when it came to immigration because they had a view that it affected labor and they wanted to protect labor. And then they very quickly shifted from being restrictionist to, instead of finding some sensible middle ground or anything when it came to immigration, started embracing open borders because that's what a lot of their moneyed interests wanted. And they also at the same time became more and more critical of America, the American dream, and just, the entire, I think, maybe rose-colored glasses history of America that some people might have been given in the 50s and 60s really turned around against that in a huge overcorrection. So what you had is open borders combined with this idea that being American wasn't necessarily a good thing. And that's where their immigration policy really reflected that. So you had them not caring if people who came over wanted to be American or if they just wanted goodies or a job or whatever the motivation was. They didn't seem to have any real desire to have immigration work both for America and for the immigrant. Instead, just to work for cheap labor was the idea.
And why does that matter to Democrats, right? Because if you think about in my lifetime, the parties have basically shifted poles. Like North Pole, South Pole has completely tipped on its axis, where when I was growing up, the narrative was, oh, well, Republicans are for the big banks and what at the time was big tech, right? Whether that was GE or whatever the tech company of the 80s and 90s were, Kodak, like big business, big banks, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And then in some crazy maturation of, I think, basically the hippie movement, they were like, well, no, we're not really for the ignorant blue collar worker who doesn't take tea at 5 o'clock. We're for kind of the more educated class that the hippie movement came out of. And it's just been a complete shift of you now look at Trump rallies and you get your blue collar working guy who's now a staunch Republican instead of a staunch Democrat. And that has changed in my lifetime, definitely my parents' lifetime.
Yeah. And I think it started changing. Yeah, definitely in your parents' lifetime. It started changing early in our lifetime, except for the reputations were just really sticky. And so you had an idea that Democrats were for the working man, a reputation that they were for the working man. And you still had people like Bernie Sanders who were very loud in support and kept some of the Democrats' old ideas.
Yeah.
For example, it wasn't until I think the past decade that Bernie Sanders finally became for basically open borders. Before that, he was very restrictionist until the early 2000s, maybe 2010s. So that I think was kind of the final nail in the coffin of protectionism for labor by the Democrats. And
yeah, like when Bernie ran for president 9-10 years ago, when the DNC basically railroaded him and gave the nomination to Hillary, I was not a fan of Trump at all. I thought he was a narcissist, probably still think he's a narcissist, had no clue what his policies would be. I was like, well, if it's Bernie versus Trump, I might vote for Bernie. I venomously disagree with most of his policy stances, but at least he's like intellectually congruent, right? He's been saying the same shit since the 60s. He's for the working man. He's for government help, which again, I don't agree with a lot of that stuff, but I'm like, well, he's been consistent and he seems like he's not as much of a sellout to the corporate shills because he's one of the few people that's been in Congress for 40 years and doesn't have $100 million net worth. So I was like, well, maybe I can get on board with this guy because he's at least intellectually congruent. And that has changed in the last few years where he's like, no, I need the corporate money if I'm going to run again.
And that really changed in 2016, I think, when he was running against Hillary for the nomination. And the DNC totally cheated him out of it with both their superdelegates and just changing rules and, Hillary getting debate questions beforehand from the DNC chair, Donna Brazile. So you had him being totally sabotaged by the party. And what did he do when he lost that nomination, basically? But I think Hillary probably still would have got it, but they absolutely cheated to help her get it. And what did he do in response? He just gave them all his donor list, his email list, his support, his endorsement for absolutely nothing. I mean, you see that in comparison, what he could have done. You look at like the extractions that RFK took when it came to Trump. Trump wasn't necessarily for the Make America Healthy Again movement. I don't think he was against it either. He just didn't really care. But RFK was able to get in there and say like, yeah, I'll give you my support, but here's what I want. Bernie could have done that same thing. And instead, he just kind of sold out to the DNC and said, no, I'll be a party man, party above principle. Even though I think he's technically an independent,
yeah, I think he was till like 6 years ago. He was registered as an independent who caucused with the Democrats, but now I think he changed that because of some election laws or something. Now he's officially a Democrat.
Yeah.
I want to come back to the open borders question. I'm going to put a pin in that. But tell me about what Republicans get wrong when it comes to immigration, right? Because I would think if there was a title for a book, nationalism and immigration wouldn't go in the subtitle. Like those two things don't seem like at all possibly congruent or they can work together. So explain like what the Republicans get wrong and then let's dive into the subtitle of the book.
Yeah. So I think, what's interesting with Republicans right now is you see very much there's two camps. And this blew up basically right before we released the book where you had Vivek Ramaswamy have a big tweet thread about what immigrants do right, what immigrant families do right, how they're in line with American values and how they don't. I think Vivek's major point was that we've really softened as a country with our values and our ideals and not in a good way. And that immigrants have that hard driving, risk taking, determination, grit, discipline that is maybe missing, that maybe we've accidentally or intentionally bred out of Americans. And bred isn't really the right word because it's a function of the education establishment, how we raise our kids, maybe the self-esteem movement. There's a lot that's in there that's caused the problems. But you saw that at the same time as the Bannon wing of the Republican Party that's very much more restrictionist and seemed like if they could shut off immigration to zero, they would do it. So I think the Bannon wing of the Republican Party has it wrong. I think Vivek's argument, which is similar to the argument that we make in the book in a lot of respects, is right on. I'm glad that it took us 5 years because I feel like the book now is a chance to maybe convince people at this juncture where the Republican Party is kind of deciding which way it's going to go on immigration to convince them of the correct road to take.
Yeah. You get these two narratives out of immigration, right? From the left, it's just the poor old lady who wants to come here for a better job or clean houses or bring her family or have a better opportunity, which I'm very sympathetic to. And unfortunately, the one podcast episode that we have not been able to release was a 3-hour interview we did with a Border Patrol officer who, after we recorded it, and we even offered to blur out his face and hide his name and change the voice a little bit. He called me and he's like, hey man, I'm like 6 years from retirement. And this was during the Biden administration. He's like, I cannot have this blowing up in my face and lose my job. But he shined a lot of light into like yes, there are some families trying to come across. He's like, but 90% of what's happening is cartel trafficking, human trafficking, drug trafficking, and even the people that are trying to come here under the best pretenses of making a better life for their family, they are getting juiced financially, raped in the back of U-Haul trucks. It is a disgusting journey into America illegally. And so you get this democratic view where it's like, no, it's just this poor, unfortunate soul that wants a better life. And I'm super sympathetic to that. But the execution of that move across the border is a human travesty. And then from the Republican side, you get like, well, Muslims and military-aged men who are like the age of men who would want to come try to make a better life for themselves.
Yeah.
This term, military-aged men from China and Muslim countries, they're coming here and they're going to start effectively a World War III on our soil. And I'm like, well, neither of those are true. Can we just have some common sense conversation in the middle? So how do you first frame that conversation of what's actually going on at the border? So then hopefully you can institute like actual immigration reform.
Yeah. So I think the way that I'd frame that is that we used to be more picky about the way we did immigration. And it would still be immigrants who we want to help and immigrants who also can help America. But the main focus is that they have to be able to make a life here, assimilate, learn the language, not be a burden on the system, be contributing members to the public, engage civically. And I think one of the big examples of this is probably, after the fall of Saigon in 1975, we had tons of Vietnamese who came over here. I think probably 150,000. There were about 50,000 that were in camps in Pendleton for months and months and months. They housed them in the barracks, they housed them in tents, and part of what they were doing there is they wanted people to start assimilating, learning the language, and also they were vetting them very, very carefully, working with allies that we had from before in South Vietnam to make sure that we weren't letting our enemies in. And what we did is when people didn't meet that criteria, we said, sorry, Charlie, you got to go back home. Literally Charlie in this case.
Yes, I was going to say,
and
pun intended.
Pun intended. So we also had, you had to have sponsors. Religious groups, civic groups, individuals would sponsor Vietnamese families, Vietnamese individuals. And basically, they're just like vouching for them, saying, this person can make a living here. They'll make a good American. And it's a little bit on them to pick up the financial slack if that person becomes a burden on the system. So we went from that to just this, you don't vet anybody, you release everybody into the country immediately. Putting anybody in a camp or in a detention center or anything like that is really, really cruel. It doesn't work. I mean, that's how you get hundreds of people from the terror watch list in here, which, that the exaggerated narrative you gave that some people say of who's coming in, military-age males, I mean, to an extent, that's a very small percentage of the immigrants coming in, but that matters if you have 100 people who've pledged loyalty to ISIS who want to hurt this country. That however small of a percentage of the people coming in that is, it can do a whole lot of damage.
We found out 25 years ago it only takes about 22 of them, right?
Yeah. Yeah, some who overstayed visas, and there were immigration problems there too. And that, I think, though the Vietnam example is just really good if we decided, hey, we owe these people something because we went in and meddled in their internal affairs to try to prevent the country from being communist, and it was a disaster, and most of them are just going to get killed if we don't let them in. And so we did, but we had expectations. I think that's what's really missing. And I think for the left, my most cynical take is that it's not an oversight, that it's almost intentional because they view nationalism as so negative that why would you want the raw America immigrants coming in?
Yeah.
Why would you want the patriotic ones? What you want is you want immigrants who, when they are protesting being deported, they go and wave the flags of their home country instead of the American flag, which we saw all over the 101 freeway a couple weeks ago.
Well, it's got to be hard for, and we'll just say progressives, not all Democrats, because I know a lot of level-headed Democrats. It's got to be hard for progressives to connect those dots, or maybe impossible to connect those dots of, if you don't believe America is an inherently good place, why would you ever want somebody to come here to be an American? So there's a disconnect in like, well, why would I want you to absorb my values if you think I am the great white evil, the great American Satan, the great colonizer. And it's just the history. I agree that probably in the 50s, there was too many rose-colored glasses, right? And we weren't willing to face the horrific things that America has done. And even post-Vietnam, there was a lot of people that probably didn't want to admit that that was a whole boondoggle that we shouldn't have been involved in. But now it's like the pendulum has swung too far where everything about America is evil. So it really colors the immigration conversation, right? Because why would you want somebody to come here to be an American if you hate America?
Yeah, why isn't Nicole Hannah-Jones screaming from the rooftops, don't come here, it's awful.
Right.
You know, if that's what she thinks, she certainly writes like that's what she thinks. So if it's not just a grift, I don't know why she's not warning every immigrant who wants to come here that it's a really, really bad idea.
Right. Yeah, America, this is one of my favorite tropes when people get into like these meme battles and stuff, is like Democrats, for the most part, claim that America is the most racist, horrible, can't get ahead, billionaire oligarchy. Everything about this country is horrible. And we should have open borders so everybody can come here. It's like, well, those two thought processes are not compatible with each other.
Yeah. But it's maybe part of it, I think, is that they believe in the weakening of borders, but also I think they are anti-nationalism on behalf of other countries too. So I think they just kind of have a negative view of America, but I don't know that they would have a more positive view of another country if they lived there. I think it's almost this view of everything is awful, and so why not just have a free flow of awfulness between these awful places?
Oh, man. Can you define for me nationalism, right? Because I have my thoughts of nationalism, but as you guys discuss it in the book, what does nationalism mean? Because you can't talk about, especially if you're a middle-aged white guy, you can't talk about national pride or nationalism or any just patriotism without immediately, oh, so you're a white supremacist, you hate brown people, you hate black people. It's like, no, that's not what I said. My wife is brown. My ex-wife was so brown, she was almost black. And it's like, they were still proud to be here in America and be Americans. This is not a color thing. This is not a race thing, but you can be proud of America with all of its faults. So how do you guys define nationalism in the book? And then how do we connect those dots between nationalism and immigration?
Yeah, so I think there's a lot of different kinds of nationalism that you could tease out. And so what you're talking about is ethno-nationalism that I think is generally bad. Maybe there's some example of how it could be good, especially if it's, or at least innocuous, maybe if it's a country that isn't militaristic and that maybe doesn't have the ability to invade their neighbors, or they aren't driven to become an empire. I mean, Tahitian nationalism probably would be fine.
Okay.
You know, that's not going to turn into the Fourth Reich.
Right.
But I think World War II made people terrified of nationalism, even though it's not inherently bad. I mean, this is sort of like, not to be glib, but maybe Paul Pelosi is probably terrified of hammers, even though, you know, hammers are very good building tools and they're not inherently bad things, but you get a really bad experience with something that can be used in a really bad way, and people do become terrified of that. So ethno-nationalism, blood and soil nationalism, basically the idea that the German people are the best.
Superior
race, the Übermensch, that can turn out really bad. It did in Germany, it did in Japan, and Italy kind of went along for the ride.
Did in Turkey, did in Cambodia.
Yeah. And so I think like that's what, when people hear nationalism now, that's what they think. And it's been branded with that.
Right.
You know, and like I said, maybe Tahitian nationalism is fine, but I think American nationalism can be and probably is inherently good because it's not ethnically based. It's based on a creed, an idea, an ideal. When you talk about American nationalism, I mean, what are the kinds of things that you think of? It's, you know, it's Protestant work ethic. At least for me, I mean, and maybe because like I have resisted some of the poisoning that other people have done in that well, like whiteness or even like Europeanness doesn't really factor into it.
Right.
And probably part of my upbringing too. In Southern California, it's just, I was a minority in my first high school as a white person, and my elementary school, junior high were very mixed. And so it's just not something that ever enters the calculation, and nor should it, because the French and the Scottish are pretty different. There's an interesting thing that happens in America where almost to like paint it, and sometimes paint it negatively as a white country. You just have to keep adding people to white. So this is an inherently white country, and then all of a sudden Jews come over here and Irish come over here and Italians come over here, and they're not white, except they integrate and they start succeeding. And all of a sudden Italians, Jews, Irish, they are white now.
Yeah.
They're counted as white. And you see that happening now.
With Asians.
Asians are white adjacent, and Hispanics are largely white.
And you're talking in the political zeitgeist. They're considered as not a disenfranchised minority group. You can't point to Asians as a successful minority group, because then the pushback from the left is like, well, no, they're basically white. It's like, well, no, actually, if we're talking about like ethnic nationalism, Asian people don't look like white people. So we've got to like define the terms, because I think it's just so hard to even have a conversation about this with anybody, because they just immediately go to racism. They go to Third Reich, Germany, ethno-nationalism. But you can have pride in your country, whether you are black, white, brown, Indian, Asian. Like, I don't know why that's even a controversial issue.
Which is, and it's really silly too, because nobody looks, even a first generation Mexican who becomes an American citizen, I think we all consider them American.
Yeah.
Certainly consider their children American. I think you'd be hard pressed to find anybody, even like the most racist person, would consider their grandchildren to be American, maybe not white, but they're still American. Whereas I can't talk about Germany, even as a guy who looks like maybe he could fit in Germany. I could never be German. I could immigrate there. I could learn the language. I could buy into every German ideal, and I would never be German, because it's an ethnicity thing. American, you can become American no matter who you are if you buy into the American project. And so that's just a huge, huge difference, especially when it comes to the risk reward of embracing nationalism. I think embracing nationalism in an American sense is very, very low risk. I mean, almost no risk at all. And the reward is huge because it helps people gain a sense of belonging. The more we deflate or erase American identity and American nationalism, the harder it is for immigrants who come here to find a way to fit in.
Yeah. Yeah, my dad has a friend, Bernie, who is ethnically Hispanic. His parents, so this would have been in the 50s, were first generation, or they immigrated here from Mexico. So he was first generation born in America in 57. And through all of junior high school, so 60s and 70s, they would not allow him to speak Spanish. They were like, no, we are Americans now. We live in America. You will learn perfect English. You will not learn Spanish in this household. If you want to take Spanish in college, go for it. And so that was my experience getting to know him in the 80s. And he was always complaining because he's like, oh, there's so many immigrants now. I could sell more real estate to people if I spoke Spanish. And so you fast forward from like this mentality of the 60s of 70s, we're going to immigrate. We're proud to be here. We're excited to be here. We're working hard. Our kids are going to be raised to only speak English. Within a generation, it's now, well, I'm a third generation, some people, I'm a third generation Mexican here, but when I want to protest the deportations of illegals, most of which at this point in the administration are illegals and criminals, I'm going to carry the Mexican flag. And it's like, dude, you've never even been to Mexico outside of Cancun. It's just the weirdest shift. Yeah. And I don't understand how that happened in two generations.
I think World War II is a really, really big answer to that. And that's why the nationalism piece is important. So World War II made people terrified of nationalism and terrified of fascism. And to the point where I think they started to break down intentionally any form of national identity so that fascism couldn't arise. And I think this is actually, there's a corollary here, get like slightly philosophical, to Nietzsche, who said when he proclaimed God is dead in the late 1800s, and people often characterize that as if he was celebrating that God was dead. What it was a warning. And it wasn't that he was saying people's ideas of God or what they did in the name of God was perfect. But what he recognized was if we let science and what we call reason or anything else destroy God to where people stop believing in God, what fills that vacuum? Where are morals going to come from? And I think he had an awful answer to that, which was that it was necessary. It would create kind of a blank slate. And from that would arise this like individual Übermensch. And I don't think he was a fascist or a Nazi, but the Nazis kind of relied on that a little bit as you destroy the old, you have this blank slate, and then you build up from it. The Superman is what Übermensch means. So you build the Superman, and then we get utopia or something, or we get something better. I think there's a big corollary there to what we did with nationalism. We proclaimed after World War II, I think, nationalism is dead. And we moved into this globalist ideal where we destroyed a lot of the lines of culture intentionally. We tried to extract from people a feeling of pride for their nation and viewed it as a terrible thing. But, what was going to take its place? And I think globalism can kind of stand in for the Übermensch in that parallel. We thought that was going to solve everything. I think the problem is it's unmoored people. It's disconnected them from tradition, disconnected them from connection to community, culture, civic pride, civic values, and the nation. What you get instead is this division through multiculturalism and just kind of a grasping for any sort of identity or meaning. And schools have participated, contributed in that, and the left especially has participated and contributed to that. And a lot of it's intentional. I think this part of it isn't my idea. There's a great book by R.R. Reno called Return of the Strong Gods. And he basically refers to the strong gods as things like nationalism, these common loves that we can have, having an identity of your country, an identity of the culture that you would actually fight for. And that's been intentionally dismantled, is his argument. I largely agree with it. But where I would go a step further is that there is a solution to that, at least in America, and that is a nationalism that is based in American greatness from our founding fathers on, and the whole American project of becoming a more perfect union. Not to say that there haven't been horrible things that have happened in America that even were part of America's initial building, but this project is creating a better country. Never a perfect union, but a more perfect union, as the founding fathers said. So that source of identity is something that we need to regain. And what we argue in the book is that immigration is a way that we can regain it.
So I want to talk about that, but I want to come back to something you said about after World War II, nationalism is dead, right? We declared that, and then maybe globalism took over, or progressivism took over, or whatnot. But what's confusing to me is obviously you have the atrocities of the Jewish genocide and war in general, and I think a fairly clear-cut historical example of Germany being the aggressor that threw us into World War II. But without the nationalistic pride of the US and Russia, we're all speaking German. If the UK didn't have that intrinsic nationalistic pride of like, no, we are British, we will not be taken over by the Germans, then World War II ends very differently. So it's very interesting to me that like, yes, there was extreme nationalism that turned into fascism in Germany that caused World War II, but it was extreme pride in nationalism that fought back and won World War II. And I'm just wondering if you have any insight to this, what are the powers that be that vilified it so badly, what Germany had done, that we threw out the baby with the bathwater and we couldn't recognize that the pride nationalism of Russia, the UK, and ourselves did in fact win the war and make the world a better place?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I can only guess at what the people were thinking who decided to deflate nationalism after World War II. But I would assume they looked at Germany as a cautionary tale, that this could be any country that gets so wrapped up in its national pride. And in the context of Europe, too, I mean, World War II was horrific and awful. But how many horrific and awful wars, maybe not to that extent, World War I to that extent, but maybe not to that extent had there been? I mean, Europe was just always these...
Yeah, the Prussians were fighting, the Serbians were fighting,
the whole history of Europe is people defining themselves as a people and then going and fighting other people.
Yeah.
So you can see maybe where they would see the dangers of that, see how It happened in Germany. We don't talk about the Japanese nationalism, but very similar and very much thought of themselves as superior and everybody else is subhuman. So I think they saw it as a cautionary tale and said, hey, we should get off this train before it arrives at what might be the inevitable destination.
Yeah. Have you ever read The World is Flat?
Yeah, long time ago. Thomas Friedman.
Friedman, yeah. I read that, and I think there might be a through line here, and I generally try not to prescribe a deep-seated evil to people. So I think this was probably with the best of intentions. But if you read The World is Flat, and he talks about, until recently, 2 countries that had created enough economic wealth to have McDonald's had never gone to war with each other. That has since changed. But when he wrote this book in the late 80s, early 90s, that was true. It's like you get to a point of economic wealth through globalism and through basically outsourcing of activities and economic prosperity. And you get to the point. So I'm thinking, as we're talking through this, post-World War II, the powers that be, whether that was politicians or bankers or the Rothschilds or whoever, in a attempt to end world wars and really do something good, did they start to go down this path of like, well, we see the future. And if we're global and materials are outsourced to Africa and it's built in China and it's consumed by America, there will be no reason for war because there will be no scarcity, right? There'll be just abundance of free-flowing economy and globalism fixes that. So I wonder if we're 70 years down this path on what started with the best of intentions.
Yeah, I think it's less abundance and more interdependence that they thought would prevent it. You know, I think it was Milton Friedman who said, where goods don't cross borders, armies will.
That's a good quote.
And so, yeah, I don't know that any of this was ill-intended, but the inevitable conclusion of is that you have leaders of country who care more about the globe than they do about their own people. That is a recipe for disaster. And
explain why. Because my 2 liberal friends that are listening to this are like, well, that's how it should be. We should be a one world society and we should care about everybody. So why is that not good?
So primarily why that's not good is I think there's a lot of roads I could go down with this. I think maybe we'll tackle a couple of them. But first of all, there's kind of a locus of control thing here where, you know, first order yourself, then your family, then your community, and so when you have dysfunction at the grassroots level, nobody thinks it's moral. If your family is a mess, nobody would think of you as a good dad, the right kind of dad, or even a good person if you, while your family was a mess, decided, you know what, I'm going to go take care of this other family across the country or in another country instead of my own. Or maybe I'll give them maybe I will just give all of the families of the world equal attention, including mine. They will all get, however, there's probably 3 billion families in the world right now. So my family will get 1/3 billionth of my attention and another family will get 1/3 billionth of my attention. I mean, it's silliness. It's silliness to think that could be any sort of way for governments to function or societies to function. It's the top-down kind of thinking and hubris that allowed for the communists to rise in so many countries, thinking that they could order all of societies from the top down like that, especially when you look at expansionist communist societies, because they had the same global aspirations. It was workers of the world unite, not workers of Moscow unite, and we'll create a good community here and we'll all share everything. No, it was the world. And it doesn't matter what your culture is. We're going to, across cultures, we're just going to have workers and somebody will be at top and they won't abuse their power. And this will all be a great system. I feel like I'm being unfair, but I do think it really is that silly.
Yeah, it's absolutely that silly, right? So you need locus of control. So your leaders have to care about the people that are within their vertical of control.
Yeah.
And then what's another reason why that's silly for my, again, liberal friends who are rolling their eyes of like, no, I like that Obama went to Europe and introduced himself as a citizen of the world and tried to do this kumbaya shit where we're going to bring everything together. And it's like, you and I would argue like, no, Obama should be there arguing for and working towards the best interests of the United States, not Ukraine or Ireland or whoever.
Yeah, it's funny too, because it's the same people that you're talking about are people who I hear who want to protect democracy. And usually it's protecting democracy from democracy, because democracy would mean that Obama is our representative. He wasn't elected by the globe. He was elected by us to represent us. So for him to go abroad and say, I represent everybody, it's not democratic at all. It upends the whole entire idea of democracy. So I don't know. Back to locus of control, though, I think also the things that you can have the most positive change on are the things that you should be focused on, and that for almost everybody is the things near to them, not the things that are very far away. And there's a heat map that goes around a lot these days that I see where it has a kind of a difference between conservatives and progressives, where they have these concentric circles. And so the center of it is like you and your family, and then your community, and then your state. And conservatives place a much higher value on things close to them, and then it kind of bleeds out. And it's not that they don't care at all about something very, very far from them, but they care less. I think the people that think that that should be equal, like progressives, and their heat map is the opposite. It's they care the least about the things close to them and the most about the things far away from them. But maybe the underlying mistake there is they view care as an infinite resource, which it definitely isn't. You can only give so much attention to. So my wife does not have the same value as somebody else's wife in Azerbaijan to me. I would be really weirded out if that Azerbaijani husband valued my wife the same as he valued his own. It just doesn't compute. It doesn't make sense. I have very little effect. I shouldn't care more about that. And we, both being in the military, I think you learn about this kind of instinctively because you have your area, your AOR, your area of responsibility. And you're supposed to handle, and whether that's people who are gunfighters or not, you have your area of responsibility. Or maybe if you're doing close quarter battle, you have your sector or whatever it is. And I'm not supposed to be looking out into my sector equally as I am to every other sector. That would just be a mess.
Everybody would be dead.
It doesn't function. It doesn't work. And the people who espouse that view, I think they're just, I don't know what the mistake is, but they're fundamentally mistaken. And maybe it is that they just think care is an infinite resource. And
I've got an idea on this. I want your feedback on this. Maybe they're not misled that care is infinite resource, but this is going to be a very long story, but I'll get to the point. A couple of years ago when the market was on fire, we were making tons of money and whatnot. I might have even told the story before with you on the podcast. I sent out an email to every buyer's agent and every listing agent and every client I had closed a transaction with that year. So we're talking like 300 people, 300 buyer's agents, 300 listing agents, 300 clients we served. And I was like, hey, man, it's been a blessing of a year for us. I know this is like a once in a generation windfall with money coming out of the trees because rates are so low. My family wants to give back. If you have anybody you want to donate to, fill out this Google form. And my wife and I are going to like donate $10,000 to people in our community who are having like a rough Christmas. I got 2 responses out of 300. 2 responses. So we gave these 2 families $5,000 each and helped them out. And it was great. It was beautiful. Like they really needed it. And I called a few of my friends who I know are very progressive. One was a financial planner on the West Side who had referred me a deal. Another was a realtor that lives in my area. And I called him and I was like, hey man, like this is kind of weird. I just want to have a conversation with you. Every one of your Facebook posts are about pick the social post of the day, Black Lives Matter, save Ukraine, save Palestine, whatever. You seem to just have this endless empathy for human beings. But when somebody who was like, hey, I want to give out free money to people who are in need, you couldn't even respond to an email. And I think I talked to 3, 4, 5, 6 people about this same thing. And every single one of them to a T said, to tell you the truth, Scott, I don't know any broke people. So I'm just wondering if we've gotten to this point where the liberal conclaves of America in LA, New York, Austin are so fucking wealthy and there's so much relative abundance that they have to I wrote down this, outsource their empathy to Ukraine or Palestine because they actually don't have anybody in their circle of friends to be empathetic towards.
I mean, I don't think that's a function of LA. I mean, if you walk around LA, there are plenty of people who are not wealthy.
Yeah, but nobody who my wealthy friends are friends with.
These are self-constructed bubbles. And if they wanted to find something close by, it would not be hard to do. I think what part of this is, so they're glomming on to the idea of the day. And I think that is partially a result, if I want to take the most charitable interpretation of this, I think that's largely a result of the flattening of everything. And
Explain that.
We used to have local news. We used to have local newspapers. We used to have community organizations, elk lodges, bowling clubs,
Boy Scouts,
where you would encounter these problems. You would encounter these people. I don't know all the causes of it, but it could just be as simple as economics. I mean, if you are creating a news program, where is the top talent and where is the most production money going to go? It's going to go toward national news because you have a potential audience of 330 million people. And so maybe it's as simple as the economics of it, of being able to have these large audiences versus much smaller potential audiences, is where all that money goes, where all that talent goes. And so then you're watching, listening to the most talented people nationally. They're just not going to, somebody in Los Angeles isn't going to be as interested in a podcast that really gets into local Las Vegas. And I think everybody wants to pay attention also to just what's on top. What's the top topic? Who's the top person? And there's a really interesting podcast I listened to by comedian but very deep thinker Andrew Heaton. And the podcast was called Why Can't America Europe? And he makes the amazing observation that people in Sweden pay attention to their top election the most, just like we do. But for Sweden, their top election is administering over 8.5 million people, whereas that's way less people than the population of Los Angeles.
Yeah.
But Los Angeles people aren't paying attention to as much to, maybe now, but who the mayor is, as you're not going to have most people in LA, I should say more people in LA are going to know who the president is than who the mayor of LA is.
Yeah.
And so everything just kind of filters to whatever we make that top level. And I think, so part of that is a problem of being in a country of 330 million people. And you are on social media where everything's flattened. You're listening to national news where everything's flattened. So then, yeah, I guess Ukraine is the issue, or whatever happens to be the top global issue, or maybe the top national issue, that is the issue. And the issues in your community, especially if you're behind a gate and you don't have to actually deal with them, then they don't exist.
I can't understand the person who's got the little profile ring on their Facebook page of I stand with Ukraine, as they literally step over a homeless person in downtown LA to go to dinner. It's just this weird thing. And I guess, again, it's the flatness, it's the higher level national problem. But it's like, how are you comfortable at the end of the day sending your tax dollars, my tax dollars, your tax dollars to a country that I think we have very little geopolitical relevance in, or I could care less if Ukraine falls. I'm sorry to say that out loud, other than the lives that will be lost getting to that point. But how can you be that person that's so empathetic that you go to change the little ring around your Facebook and tell everybody you stand with Ukraine, even though you couldn't point it out on a map 6 months ago, and then you just walk over a body on Figueroa Street when you're getting to the restaurant without a second thought of giving that guy $10?
Yeah, because I think in Ukraine you have very plausible deniability for any accountability. So it's empathy without accountability. You can't actually do anything except for yell and scream. And so yelling and screaming becomes yelling and screaming about Ukraine is as good as you can do. So you're doing the top thing. You're getting an A+ in American support for Ukraine. Whereas the accountability, if you wanted an A+ in helping the homeless situation in Los Angeles, that'd be a lot more work. It would be a lot messier. I think that's a big part of it too, is you want to be able to proclaim these ideals, but you maybe don't want to have to tell a homeless person like, hey, you need to get off drugs, you need to get your life together, because drugs are fine and we don't judge and everybody can live the way that they want to and you have a right to be homeless, and becomes this toxic empathy. But toxic empathy directed toward other countries, you don't have to deal with the ramifications of that. You do have to deal with the ramifications of what happens close to home.
Yeah. I just think in America, we've gone from like outsource the empathy where I don't have to be held accountable to toxic empathy to now a lot of areas in the world, the Western world, are on a path to suicidal empathy, which I think one of the reasons I'm very pro-immigration is because, and I'm sure you talk about this in the book, I'm embarrassed. I just got the book on Amazon, so I haven't had a chance to dive in yet. I think what a lot of people don't understand is that without immigration, most countries in the world are on a suicide death spiral because their birth rate is not currently replacing their population. So South Korea, Japan, the UK, other than the fact that they're getting bred out by the Muslim population. Like, there is a lot of first world countries around the world that for each family are not having at least 2.2 kids to replace themselves. And they are on a death spiral of population collapse. America would probably be in the same way if we didn't have massive immigration into the country, legal or illegal. So is part of the book in here like, hey, if we want to survive and thrive as a country, we have to accept immigration. So let's do it right.
Yeah, certainly. And part of it is that, and that, well, I might not have a great answer for Europe.
I think Europe's lost, by the way.
Because, to be frank, they're just not good at assimilating immigrants the way that we are. Neither of us are selecting for immigrants that are good fits right now, but at least we're better at assimilating. I think that does naturally happen with a lot of immigrants who maybe even came here not intending to assimilate. We're better at it. And that has a lot to do with our founding ideals and the way that America was set up to take as many different ethnicities and cultures as we could who wanted the same idea of freedom and self-determination and hard work and not having a government that puts up roadblocks, not having a king that tells you what to do, but being able to be in charge of your own destiny, being able to be in charge of your own flourishing, your own thriving. Those kinds of people are who we selected for it. The culture was what I would say is the parts of the culture that are maybe more visible but don't matter as deeply. We built a country where all of that can come in, and it works as long as people are into this substrate that we have underneath whatever, sombreros or kilts or, whatever these kind of visible but not deeply philosophical parts of culture are. We can easily absorb that and make it part of America as long as the idea does fit in with, we have strong communities, strong families, strong individuals, people who set their own course, make their own destiny. And that happens at that individual level on up to, I would say, the community level. And we do much better as a country when we're kind of a decentralized collection of communities like that who all have the same American values as that substrate that underlines that. And then it fits together, even though it's not like New Orleans is like Phoenix. These are very different cultures, different places, but they do have that underlying American substrate.
Yeah, because I think what you're saying, and tell me if I'm comprehending this correctly, like on the surface level, right, you get people in college losing their mind that a white person wore a sombrero or a Mexican person had dreadlocks or some type of cultural appropriation, because that's the surface bullshit level. I could care less about any of that as long as the people that I'm talking to have a shared commonality of work ethic, entrepreneurism, building families, building community. It's like something that's been totally eye-opening to me as this has gotten crazier and crazier, where progressives will just, everything is a microaggression and everything is racist, although I think we finally turned the corner on that and some of the DEI stuff. It's like, dude, walk into any jiu-jitsu gym and you have from millionaires to dudes that can't pay their rent, every ethnicity, every creed. We got 2 transgender people that work out at our gym, and we're all drinking each other's sweat and putting each other in the most physically compromising, awkward positions, and nobody gives a shit. It's kind of like when we're in the military and like you don't really see race in the military, you don't see creed, ethnicity, religion. It's just like everybody's there in this melting pot, and anybody that thinks that there's like massive racism in the world, of which there is some, just go to a jiu-jitsu gym. Just go to your local jiu-jitsu gym and see the varied socioeconomic and ethnic people and religious ideals that are working out the same place. But the shared commonality is like, oh, we all want to get in a workout. We want to work hard. We want to work better. And not surprisingly, there's a lot of people at our jiu-jitsu gym that are also like entrepreneur based, right?
Well, yeah. And I think, so you're hitting on something really crucial here, I think, and that's that America is, the American dream, at least, the American ethos is a meritocracy. And that's why that works in a jiu-jitsu gym. That's why that works in the military. I think the further that you get away from a meritocracy, the less that works, the more you're stoking racism. The highest meritocratic systems, I think you'll find the least amount of sexism and racism.
Yeah.
And the least meritocratic, you're going to find the most, because you're looking at secondary characteristics, not the core of a person and their abilities and their work ethic. And it just turns into, what are these secondary and tertiary characteristics that we can bond over that don't matter as much as the mission.
Hey there, Scott Groves with a quick interruption to the podcast. Sorry about that, but I just want to take a quick minute to announce our sponsors here for the podcast, and that sponsor is me, Scott Groves. It's actually the revenue that we generate through doing mortgages here at Neo Home Loans, and the money that we generate from the coaching program that I run, Consolidated Coaching for Loan Officers, coaching by loan officers for loan officers, that helps support this podcast. I really started this in 2021 as a passion project during COVID, and we're excited to bring you a new episode every week, but this only happens if I'm making money in my real full-time job. So please, if you or somebody you know is looking to buy, sell, or refinance a house, our team is licensed in almost every state in the country. And if you know a loan officer who's looking for sales coaching, personal development coaching, lead generation coaching, please, please, please get in touch with us. Scott at the Scott Groves team. We'd love to hear from you. We'd love for you to support our other endeavors, which is mortgage financing and loan officer coaching, which allows this podcast to exist. Now back to your regularly scheduled programming. Hey, many people before me have used this example, but nobody's complaining that there's not a 5'2" overweight guy in the NBA, because it's very clear that you have to be able to perform meritocracy. You have to be able to put the ball in the hoop. And if you're a 5'2", overweight, middle-aged guy, you're not playing in the NBA, right? And it's like nobody's complaining about that.
Yeah.
Because that's clearly merit-based. And in jiu-jitsu, it's very clear who's on top and who's winning and who's getting choked. And so nobody cares about any of the other bullshit.
Yeah, and so it's ironic that the people who claim to care the most about racism are also the people who try to dismantle meritocracy. Those are the people most opposed to meritocracy are also the people who say that they're most opposed to racism. They just won't embrace the one thing that we've shown dismantles racism best.
Yeah, I like that. So talk a little bit more about the book. Like, how do we solve for the immigration problem? Simple. It's really simple. How do we solve the massive immigration problem? Because in fairness, and I understand why this is a path of argumentation when it's like, I'm having a discussion with somebody that thinks differently than me. And I'm like, well, I think we should shut down the border. And then they immediately go to, well, did you know that most illegals here are actually overstaying visas? And I'm like, well, yeah, we should fix that too. And then they're like, well, but did you actually know that more people can come in through Canada? And I'm like, okay, yeah. So we should fix that too. But it's like just this constantly moving of the goalpost where we give up any hope. And we've seen the same thing in Doge trying to cut down the government.
To say the exact same thing.
It's just like, well, it's $50 million. I'm like, $50 million in federal spending is more money being spent in 1 year than you and everybody you've ever known will pay in federal taxes in their entire fucking lifetime. So just because 50 million is a trivial amount as compared to 4 trillion, it's still a lot of money. But we just keep doing this merry-go-round where it's like, well, there's a bigger problem over here. There's a bigger problem over here. There's another problem over here. It's like, well, we got to start somewhere and fix something.
Yeah, that just needs to be called out for what it is. It's people saying you're not allowed to make the problem better. You're only allowed to create a utopia in one swoop. Because that is that seems to be the idea. And nobody ever gets anywhere that way. It's by chipping away that you achieve great things. It's not just one master stroke. Those people, I've grown less and less patient, I think, like over the past 5 years with people like that. I really just do think they're the enemies of progress as much as that language might be charged.
Yeah.
I really do think that they're just gripers, they're complainers, and maybe it is a way to feel better about themselves. I think where I started to lose patience with this was when I went to a Libertarian Party convention because I wanted to get the last chair of the Libertarian Party, Angela McArdle, I wanted to get her put in charge of it because she had this idea of, hey, how about instead of just complaining this isn't utopia, how about we make a little bit of progress? And she did. I think they had a lot of influence on the Trump administration. They got Ross Ulbricht, the founder of the Silk Road, pardoned. And
he did get pardoned?
Yeah.
I didn't know that.
Yeah, he is out and he is free.
Oh.
And that was one promise that they extracted from Trump as a way to get libertarian votes. And it's funny, actually, if you look across the country, it really did make a difference, the amount of libertarians that voted for him. But I think you saw it really clearly there. The people that wanted to be comfortable in their loser club that's never expected to change anything, to win anything, to do anything. I mean, that is a comfortable state to be in.
Yeah. It's easy to be a libertarian because you can just complain about everything.
Yeah. And you never have to put your ideas to a proving ground. You never have to show how we get from A to B to C. You just complain that we're not at C, and that if we were at C, everything would be perfect, or at least be a lot better. And maybe you're right in that. We talked about this on our first podcast, but philosophically, I'm basically an anarchist because I think anarchic relationships without government, without coercion, are the only moral relationships you can possibly have. That's my philosophical lodestar. That's where I get if I'm just having this natural rights argument. But I also live in the real world.
Right.
And so I'm not going to dismiss a policy improvement that does make an improvement.
Yeah.
Just because it's not anarchism. Perfect. Yeah, it's not this anarchic ideal, so I'm going to complain about it. And so that became really tiresome. In those communities, you have, I think, groups that have become very, very distinct. And it's the people who do actually want to work toward a better future and the people who want to complain that this isn't their philosophical ideal that in a vacuum they know is correct. And I agree with them that in a vacuum it is correct. I'm sympathetic to that, but at some point you have to come down from your moral Mount Olympus and deal with the messiness of real life.
Which is so funny because, I mean, these are the conversations I have with my 9-year-old, right? We're walking across the parking lot and somebody's texting and driving. I'm like, hey, stop. And he's like, hey, Dad, was she not paying attention? Were we allowed to walk there? I'm like, yes, we were absolutely allowed to walk there. You absolutely could have been walking. And if it's your body versus car, guess who wins? Doesn't matter who was right or who had the right of way.
Yep.
Like if you get drilled by a car, you die. So it's like we have to live in the real world and we have to also know what the rules are, right? And that's very hard to explain to children who have this innate sense of like right or wrong, right? But I think there's almost like this full circle kind of pathway that you're putting together where it's funny. If you think about grumpy libertarians and progressives are the ones that are most preventing the progress because they can't single wand stroke have utopia.
Yes.
What's interesting is if those are the same people that don't believe in a meritocracy, they don't even understand that concept because they've never worked within a confines of a meritocracy where you have to chip away, you have to keep showing up, you have to practice the free throw shots over and over again. If they've never experienced that or they don't believe in that, how would we expect them to understand that politically we have to go step A, B, B2, B3, and like eventually we'll get to this utopia, no racism in the entire world, but like you can't take a Nazi and go from A to Z, right? You got to stay in Germany for 3 generations to change the mindset of the country with American bases.
Yeah, just like if you're learning guitar, you can celebrate learning a Nirvana song and not get mad that it's not, a Decemberists or some like prog rock crazy guitar song. You chip away and you get there eventually and you can be happy about the progress. It's more...
Start with Green Day. They only play 3 chords in like all 5 of their albums.
There's a economist from Duke, Michael Munger, who criticizes or maybe at least identifies 2 types of libertarians where he calls them, gosh, I'm going to mess this up, directionalist libertarians and destinationalist libertarians. And so the ones that we were talking about that are part of the loser club are the ones who just focus on this is the destination, whereas the directionalists are like, no, we're moving in the correct direction. This is good. And we're allowed to think it's good. We're allowed to be happy about it. We're allowed to be happy about progress that is not yet perfection.
Yeah.
And that's just a much healthier, not only is it better for progress, like it's better for you and your soul. It's just like a healthier way to live, to be able to be grateful for the steps that we make. And I think that's where a lot of the people too who criticize America for all of its past sins, where they really are messing up here and not recognizing that America was directionally correct in most of those periods that they're criticizing. And it doesn't mean that you don't say those things were wrong, but you do recognize that this is progress that has happened. You don't pretend that slavery is some unique in a vacuum evil that was done by America. It was done worldwide. I'll give the British their due credit, but it was done worldwide until the British and then us started saying, you know what, not only we're not accepting this in our own countries, we're not accepting this anywhere anymore. And So that anti-slavery movement was directionally correct. And I think what's amazing too is you find that there are slaves who recognized this. I mean, Frederick Douglass's love for America and love for the American ideals is crazy. And people love to selectively quote from, To a Slave, What is the 4th of July, his speech that he gave, and the negatives in there without going further down the speech and him expressing that the Constitution is a great document and that we're not living up to it. And that was the same thing, the same Martin Luther King kind of argument, that these American foundational ideals, these things that we can be nationalist about and proud of and that can connect us, they are good even if we're not living up to them. And we just need to keep moving closer, 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 becoming a more perfect union. I think we've taken a big step back since World War II. Back to that, there was this intentional dismantling of it. And I think we're finally actually at a place where that is starting to swing the other way.
Yeah. I wish we would have had this podcast a couple months ago and me heard this idea, especially on the libertarian side, of directional versus destination. Because I lost several friends over this last election cycle, and a couple of these particularly asshole realtors who never, ever, ever say anything political on their page. They're never willing to take a stance. They clearly have no opinion on any of this stuff. Anytime I would post something politically, they were just straight to the comment sections to fight to the death. Oh, you're voting for Trump because you're a Nazi, blah, blah, blah. That type of crazy stuff. And I'm like, this one guy, Dave, I'm like, Dave, like, I know your kids. You knew my ex-wife who is Indian. You knew my girlfriend before that who is black. My current wife who's Mexican. You know I have 3 mixed race kids. How dare you call me a Nazi, first of all? And second of all, like, I don't even understand what you're trying to argue about. Well, and this was his thing. Well, you just claim to be this libertarian, and that's just your way of hiding in California behind not saying you're a conservative and that you're clearly going to vote for Trump. And so what I tried to explain to him is I said, I was trying to take the high road here where I should have just told him to fuck off. What I was trying to explain to him was that I am a libertarian in like ethos of how I think perfection should be. But just like the Democrats have done a great job creating a coalition of one issue voters, whether that's gay rights or trans rights or abortion or the environment or whatever, I'm basically a one issue voter. Before we can do anything else, we can't have any more wars. Mm-hmm. And we clearly have a 4-year track record of Trump not getting us into wars. Biden, right back to business as usual with the military industrial complex. So for me, step one in getting closer to a libertarian idea is no wars, less foreign interventionism, less CIA trying to fucking overthrow governments under the guise of USAID. I don't know why people cannot understand that, because I'm sure if I was to like dig into Dave's brain, he's a one issue liberal progressive voter because of some issue. I don't know what that issue is. Yeah. Maybe it's abortion or whatever, but it's like, you'll clearly accept all the other excesses of the party, a man fighting against your daughter in an athletic endeavor. You'll excuse all that because you're a one issue voter. Why can't you see that when that happens on the Republican or the Libertarian side? And clearly I was just pissing into the wind because none of them wanted to have a real conversation, but I couldn't explain it the way you just explained it, the destination versus the direction.
Well, and that's why their kind of attack on libertarian ideals and hiding away as libertarians, it's why it hits, is because for somebody else who wasn't you, that could be a valid argument. For about half of people who call themselves libertarians and who are destinationalists, I think that is a valid criticism.
Yeah.
And I think one of the only arguments that I will accept in favor of Harris, and I didn't vote for Harris or Trump, but of the two, I absolutely think that Trump was the right choice if you have to choose between the two. I live in California. My vote doesn't matter, so I didn't have to. Basically, though, I think if somebody's being really honest down to their bones, the only reason to vote for Kamala Harris is because you're doing pretty well and you prefer a managed decline of America than turning the ship around, because turning the ship around is going to be hard. There's going to be some pain, and you would just rather, it's more comfortable for things to just gradually get a little bit worse and a little bit worse and a little bit worse, and they'll still be pretty comfortable by the time you die. And that's kind of what we saw. And, we saw that in Britain for sure, pre-Margaret Thatcher. And she maybe turned it around a little bit, but it really is just managed decline. And I think that's what the entire West is going through right now, is a managed decline to avoid discomfort.
Explain that more. A managed decline of What?
Of culture, of innovation, of progress. It's basically just a stagnation. While other countries become more and more dynamic, we become less and less dynamic as we put more regulations in place, as we have more taxes, more of a nanny state, more of a guaranteed retirement, guaranteed medical care, guaranteed all of these rights that depend on extracting money from other people to fulfill them. And kind of this view of positive rights until we're forced by financial realities to do something else. And I think a lot of these people are just betting on that we can keep kicking the can down the road until at least our generation is gone.
Yeah.
And leave other people to deal with it.
Yeah, this is the boomer dilemma, right? Where like the last 40 years has been the greatest transfer of wealth from younger generation to older generation. And they're like, well, if we can stay the reserve currency for another 30 years until I die, you know, if we can just keep running up deficit spending and hopefully we don't hit that Venezuela, Argentina, Greece type level of national debt before I die, it'll be okay. I'll give my money to the kids. They'll figure it out. It's like, I don't think anybody's saying that to themselves consciously, but I think subconsciously, like you can't look at a country that is currently spending more money on the interest of our debt than our military. Now, you could argue that the military spending is bloated and whatnot, but I think even the most crazy of progressives or communists would be like, yeah, we probably need a military, right? Probably need some defense industry. But our interest on debt is currently more than we spend on military. And I think they said within 10 years, the interest on our debt will be more money than we spend on all the entitlement programs, Medicaid, Social Security, all that stuff. That is not sustainable. Anybody looking at that objectively should not be a political issue, should not be a partisan issue. It should just be we need extreme austerity like Germany did in 2007, 2008, 2009, or we just fail to have a country.
And really beyond that, because I don't think even extreme austerity on its own won't work now. And this, I think, brings us back to immigration. We are going to have to cut and grow ourselves out of this problem. And the growth portion is, I think, going to be the primary driver of getting out of the situation.
Is that because we can't do it or we don't have the will to do it?
I don't think we even can. Like you just said, the amount we're paying just on interest on our national debt. I don't know how we come back from that with cuts alone, because we're running $2 trillion deficits every year. So you're talking about cutting $2 trillion and then cutting enough to start paying down the national debt beyond that.
Yeah. And just so people understand what these numbers mean, you could disband 100% of the United States military infrastructure and we would still be running a deficit, meaning that we're still spending more than we make. So for all the people that are like, well, the military budget, which they don't understand how the Congressional Budget Office shows this, discretionary spending versus non-discretional spending. So no, the military does not take up 50% of the federal budget. Like, I'm so sick of talking about that. But if you disbanded 100% of all things military, we would still be running a deficit of like $700 billion or $1 trillion a year.
Yeah. And maybe it is a political issue. The way we could do it is we could cut all of Social Security and all of Medicare and Medicaid.
Yeah. There's no will to cut it, much less taper off the benefits somehow.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So it's got to be growth. And it's funny, whether they're misplaced or not, the boomers and all of their criticisms of millennials and Gen Z, that they're lazy, that they're entitled, that they aren't risk takers, that they're soft. All of these things are so easily selected for in immigrants. Entrepreneurship, risk taking. I mean, just by people coming here, they're already ticking a lot of those boxes, even if we're not actively selecting. So even just weeding out the criminals and the people who come here thinking they're going to get some sort of social welfare benefits, even if we just weeded that out, you would have a lot of self-selection that would be very, very good for the United States. Beyond that, we have a lot of gaps that we need to plug too, that things are just going to crumble if we don't. I mean, all the stuff going on with airlines right now, the average age of an airline mechanic is 51 in the United States. So they're going to be retiring soon, and we're just not going to have enough.
Yeah.
The average age globally is like 40. And we could easily just start selecting for these jobs and these types of people, and people who also want to I think we need to make it explicit that like you are expected to learn English and to participate in American culture, to want to be American. It's funny, before the show, I had this thought in my head and I looked it up on 3 different AIs because I assumed it wasn't my own quote, but none of them could find it.
You're like, I was so smart. I had to attribute. Really? I had to believe that quote was attributed to somebody else because you're too smart.
No, because I thought I must have heard it somewhere, but it just popped into my head. And it is that the job of immigration should be to find Americans who happen to be born abroad and bring them home. So people that already have the ideals, who have the ethos, and there are so many of them around the world. And we know this because, I know this because so many of my friends are immigrants. Basically, I would say maybe a quarter of my friends are immigrants. More than half of my friends who have started their own businesses and are employing a lot of people are immigrants.
Yeah.
In the restaurant industry, in the legal industry. And I think about that. I think I'm employed by somebody whose parents fled communist Czechoslovakia and named him Sam after Uncle Sam. You know, these are people who came to America to be Americans and raised the type of kid with that ethos who decided, I'm going to start a business, I'm going to make something of myself, and I'm going to employ a bunch of people. And that is so incredibly beneficial to this country, both from an economic standpoint, but also just for the vibes. I mean, you know, we like that is nationalism. That is a positive nationalism, to look at America as this can-do place where you come over without much from fleeing a communist country and you make yourself into something huge. And I think it is like over 50% of billion-dollar businesses in America were started by immigrants.
Yeah.
Something crazy like that.
Yeah.
I don't understand. I understand. I think a mirror image of the Democrats is like a Steve Bannon, who is also looking for a managed decline through nativism, through keeping foreigners out to protect. And we can protect people, we can protect workers and still have immigration. You know, we don't have to undermine them at every turn. That's what illegal immigration does, where people come in and they can be paid slave wages and they can be treated horribly and they can have no options and they know that they can be kicked out at any moment. So those kinds of people are going to undermine American workers. But if we have a real immigration system that brings those people in with forcing them to compete on a more level playing field with other Americans, that's a great thing.
I have a anecdotal story, but I want to hear from you first on like what you were just touching on there. Why is illegal immigration the worst of all options economically for the immigrant, for the country, for the worker? Talk a little bit more on that, on why the illegal immigration is actually the worst of all options.
Yeah.
Like you can be a Steve Bannon nativist and we want nobody here. You can be in open borders, like as long as you come here illegally, everybody's going to come. But like, why is it illegal immigration specifically is the worst of all options?
Yeah, so frankly, it can be better for the illegal immigrant compared to their previous situation. That's the only directional improvement that gets made there. It can be better for upper middle class people in nice neighborhoods in LA who want to get a cheap nanny or housekeeper from Boyle Heights and pay them very low wages. And that can be mutually beneficial, but it does create a paradigm where American workers are frozen out. And you know what? Maybe you're not rich enough to have a housekeeper. I don't know. That part gets tricky because I do believe in free trade. I do believe that the things that most of its proponents say are true, and that also applies to labor, that in the aggregate, free trade will make things cheaper. But I think it's not just about GDP. It's about a culture where people can feel that they are growing, that their community's growing, that they're thriving. And frankly, I do think that takes maybe a little bit of making sure that the playing field is level. You can't say it's going to create a certain kind of dynamic that I don't think is healthy for us as a society. If you say to an employer, hey, you can hire an American legally for 5 times the amount, or you can hire an illegal immigrant who you can treat worse, who you can pay less.
Don't have to pay benefits because they're not in the system.
Don't have to worry about overtime. You don't have to worry about anything that it's what we've basically set up is we've set up, if you had a football game where one team gets 10 downs and the other team gets 3 downs, it doesn't work. We can argue about what the rules of the game should be. Maybe there should be no minimum wage. Maybe there should be no mandatory rule on paying overtime. Maybe. But you can't have one set of rules for people who are citizens here and another set of rules for people who are here illegally and have it be beneficial for employers to hire the illegals. And it creates resentment too. And that's where you get a lot of the nativists, I think, is from that resentment of the rules not being fair. But that's not a problem with immigration. That's a problem of how we're handling immigration. It's a problem of illegal immigration. It's a problem of turning a blind eye to certain rules and regulations.
Yeah, the ironic accidental racism that you see when this conversation comes up. I don't know if you ever seen this famous clip on The View where Rosie Perez was on and one of the hosts, who probably lives in Manhattan and probably has 3 Hispanics cleaning her house and cooking and taking care of her kids was like, well, Trump wants to stop illegal immigration. Who is going to clean their toilets?
Yeah.
And Rosie Perez was like, whoa. You just think all Hispanics are maids and janitors? And it's like, and this stuff comes up over and over and over again in just across America where it's like, I don't know, I've just gotten to the point, like you said, you've become less tolerant of the silly arguments the last 5 years. I've just become less tolerant of anybody on the left who tries to take the moral high ground because I'm like, no, you are the actual racist. If you actually believe there shouldn't be voter ID because African Americans can't figure out how to use a computer or get an ID, you are actually the one that is setting a lower bar for how you think of people. And I think this comes up in immigration all the time where people are like, well, if we don't have immigration, who's going to pick our strawberries? I'm like, so you want to have slave labor in return for $4 strawberries instead of $7 strawberries?
Well, and it is funny because it has a little bit of truth to it, where the thing that plays off that is people, when Trump closed the border or when he cracks down on illegal immigration, I've seen it said, I've probably said it, that Democrats haven't been this mad since the last time we took away their slaves.
Yeah, I've seen that meme, and it's not totally factually incorrect.
Yeah. And I think that's something that the left needs to contend with because it seems like it's within what they care about. They need to contend with the fact that you're saying these people should be able to come over here illegally. The situation that you're endorsing is both the awful journey where people are raped and brutalized along the way, and then they get here and they can be treated very, very poorly. And some of our legal immigration policies allow for that when you have somebody basically stuck with one employer. And if they lose that employer, then they get sent back home. That gives that employer a whole lot of leeway to treat that person in a very negative way. And it's something that you would think that the left with their ideals would be more sensitive to. I don't see that sensitivity. I don't know. Maybe they just think that illegals should maybe that sensitivity is blanket amnesty for everybody, and everybody now is magically a citizen.
But you can't do that until you close down the borders and revise the visa process.
Yeah.
And I'm fine with that. If you're here, you're paying taxes, you're working, you don't have a criminal record, cool. Blanket amnesty on January 1st, 2026. If you're here, hurrah. But you can't do that unless you have a closed down border because...
Yeah, there's ways we could accomplish that, and with a fine or with paying more in or with a guarantee that you're not going to get maybe some social welfare benefits that other citizens would naturally get. Maybe you get amnesty without Social Security and Medicaid.
So I wish somebody smarter than me would do an economic study on this because Trump's ridiculous idea of being able to basically buy a green card for $5 million, his gold card, stupidest shit ever, right? There's a finite number of billionaires that can afford $5 million to effectively put themselves on path to citizenship in America. And there's already a way to do that. The visa program where you invest $250,000 or $500,000. And there's agencies in LA who I've been contacted. It's a complete scam. They're like, hey, I have a Chinese immigrant. They're going to invest $500,000 here. They're not going to really invest the money. They're just going to buy this business that they have nothing involved with just so they can check the box. So that thing already exists. But What would be more interesting is, let's say we have somewhere between, what's the estimate? 15 and 30 million illegal immigrants?
Sure.
Okay, so let's say 20 million illegal immigrants. What would the financial impact be if you were like, hey, if you were here illegally, there will be a 6-month amnesty period where you go down to the DMV, you register, and your tax bracket will be one tax bracket higher than what you should actually pay, because that's going to be your penalty for the system. Or like you said, you work for 5 years where you don't get matching Social Security or unemployment benefits or whatever, but this will be your ticket in. I have to think the economic impact of 20 million people, or some percentage of those who register, they now have a legal path to citizenship. They can now work legally in America, and in some penalty form, they pay into the system a little bit more than the legal citizen. That has to be a ginormous, I don't even know if that's a word, financial impact greater than Trump's bullshit idea of like, okay, maybe we'll get 1,000 people to give us $5 million for a gold card path to citizenship. I think we might have just come up with a policy proposition that could work really well.
Yeah, no, and this is something that there's a lot of ways to skin this cat, but the thrust of it is absolutely correct and absolutely what I endorse. And it has to be something, I think, that immigrants who did it the right way will not feel slighted by either.
Yeah.
Because a lot of these people who want this blanket amnesty, they would not, a lot of these upper crust people, these blue bloods who want this sort of amnesty, who are maybe Harvard graduates, they would not be okay with me hopping the fence at Harvard, not paying tuition, not going to classes, not doing the work, and then getting a diploma because I'm on Harvard campus and I get Harvard amnesty, and now I also am a Harvard graduate. And citizens who jumped through all the hoops, people who are naturalized American citizens, rightly feel some sort of way about this if they did all of that, and then somebody can just cross over illegally and get a magic amnesty pardon and become a citizen. Yeah, that I think not only is it not the ideal way economically for us to do it, but it wouldn't be fair to the exact type of immigrants who we do want here.
Yeah.
And who we don't want to alienate from this country, because most of those people are like the most patriotic people you'll find.
Yeah. I wanted to tell this story, and I'm not going to use any real names or anything. And I got his permission. I got the permission of these people involved to tell the story, because I was like, oh, this really illustrates what's going on with legal versus illegal immigration. And for the two liberals, friends of mine that are maybe still listening, I want you to understand what you're endorsing when you talk about allowing this ongoing illegal immigration, which is 90% run by their cartel. So I have a good friend that I see often. He's been in the country about 2 years. He was working in Mexico, but happens to be from, oh God, I'm going to fuck this up, Venezuela or Colombia. So he had the option to ask for political amnesty because of what was going on in his country, for political asylum. So he and his wife and 2 kids walked across the desert to a U.S. detention center, basically showed their whatever it was, Venezuelan or Colombian passport, applied for political amnesty, and they went through all the right channels, right? It was this harrowing trip through the desert. He showed me videos of it because the only thing he was able to continue carrying was his kids and his cell phone. It's horrific, but he made it. He did it correctly. He now has a temporary permit to work in the country. He and his wife are like amazing contributing members of society. They're paying taxes. Their kids are great. Like, they're just going to be an American success story. That is the legal way to come into the country seeking amnesty, stayed in Mexico until he could get the paperwork done, and because this was under the Trump administration, I believe. Conversely, one of his very good friends came across with his girlfriend, but they were from Mexico. So they didn't really have a legal pathway. So they basically took all of the money that they had, paid the cartels to get them across. And in the 3-day trip, first in the back of a U-Haul where they almost died of dehydration, and then this harrowing trip across the border illegally, the gentleman's girlfriend was raped habitually for 3 days by every member on the cartel. And there's nothing he could do because one guy was holding a gun to his head while everybody took turns on his girlfriend. And that is the human tragedy that you are endorsing, that you are explicitly endorsing, if you take half a step back and understand that all of the illegal immigration that is happening, or 90% of it, is being controlled by the cartels. They're taking every last dollar from these people. They don't care if they live. They're sending children across for human trafficking. They're raping the women over and over again on this trip. And this is not just some like bullshit fear-mongering story. Like, I've talked to the people that this has actually happened to.
Well,
and it's horrific. And this is what you're endorsing if you give the perception, as Biden and Kamala did, that the border is effectively open.
Yeah. And for all of your liberal friends who don't believe Scott's stories on this, that are narratives, I'd recommend to go look up a New York Times article from a few years ago called "You Pay with Your Body." And it outlines a whole lot of these. And it's gut-wrenching. Like, I read it the first time a few years ago, and I've sent it to a couple of people. I haven't even been able to read it a second time because it is awful, and it is what they are incentivizing. When you signal to people that, like, hey, the border's open as long as you can get here. And the as long as you can get here part is not pretty. And it's something that people on the left have totally closed their eyes to. And I don't know how you can do that. I don't know how you can incentivize that. But that's where it is. And I would really encourage anybody who thinks that the open border, or who just letting people come in who show up at the border and say, hey, I need asylum for whatever reason, why you should maybe rethink that and think about maybe calling your representatives and telling them to work with Republicans on finding some sort of permanent solution to creating order on the border. A second part of why that would be important is because I think most people who have become very anti-immigration, they oppose the chaos more than anything. It's not that they are that opposed to immigrants or to immigration, but because it's been such an intractable issue that we haven't made big improvements to, I think they just see like those are the two choices, is we shut down the border and we have no immigration, or we have chaos. And those aren't the only two options, but with how politics has been for the last 30 years, they could be forgiven for thinking those are the only two options.
Right.
And so for leftists who want to continue the chaos, just know that you are creating a sentiment across the country that largely got Trump elected. Like, that's on you. That's on you in this feeling that you've created by a coalition of people, some who are nativists and don't want any immigration, some who just want order to the system. But until you solve that problem for real, you are going to make all immigration less and less appealing to the average American, less palatable. There's going to be a backlash against it.
Do you go into the book at all? Is this more of a theory book on how immigration paired with nationalism can save America and help pay down the debt by growing the pie, et cetera, et cetera? Is it more theory, or do you get into some of the policy prescriptions or the ideas on how we can actually do this practically?
Yeah, there's some broad policies that we can, like you said, the penalty idea, coming up with a real permanent solution for the DACA kids who are now not at all kids anymore.
Right.
But there's solutions, and they're intentionally broad in the book because there's going to be a lot of give and take in what we actually come to. But there should be some sort of point system too, where we are selecting for things that we want in immigrants. There should be expectations too. And a lot, in my own opinion too, that we need to do is not just rely on government for all of this. We as communities need to encourage and create a path for not just people to become Americans legally, but to become Americans culturally. And that I don't expect the government to fix the culturally part. That's something that we really need to do as Americans. That's something that we used to do as well. You know, I talked about the people that came from Vietnam and then later the boat people from Cambodia in the 80s. And my grandmother actually did a lot of, she's an incredible chef, and she did a lot of cooking for the people down in Pendleton. And that was before I was born. But I remember very young as well, my mom helped integrate a bunch of Cambodians. And we would go sometimes to this little community center, and there would be English lessons and cultural lessons and all of these things that helped these people assimilate. And we've really, I think it's part of just the dying out of these non-governmental institutions that we used to have, like I mentioned before, like an Elks Lodge or churches. And churches were huge sponsors of Vietnamese and Cambodians and would help and would make sure that they weren't ending up on the government dole and that they were developing the tools to be productive members of society and learning the social and cultural rules of being in America. Things as simple as you don't cut in line. Like, that's not a universal cultural thing.
Right. You don't push people on the subway. That's not a universal cultural thing.
Well, but I mean, even like an ideal, there are countries where it is just acceptable to cut in line. If I'm in line and I'm talking to somebody and the person in front of me moves up and there's a little gap, somebody will just squeeze right in there and it's culturally acceptable. And it's those simple things that I think we need to do. We need to take that on ourselves and not, as we were talking about before, go to that top level of the national government or whatever we don't have responsibility for, the empathy without accountability. We need to have the empathy with accountability at the local level with immigrants who come in and realize these are people who are going to maybe are as much as we have expectations for them. Maybe our kids and grandkids aren't going to create their own businesses. And if not, they're going to have to be employed. And who is going to create those businesses? Who is going to grow the economy of the United States? And to see people as an investment, but it has to be an active investment. It can't just be like, oh, well, I endorse illegal immigration and people being traumatized on their way up here and then being taken advantage of once they get here. And we're not going to help them learn the skills that they need to assimilate. And the way we're doing it is the worst of both worlds. And we do need these government policy fixes, but we also need some cultural fixes. And I think we can get into a virtuous spiral if we start doing that, where the pie keeps growing and people regain, there's been waves of anti-immigrant sentiment all throughout our country. And there's also been waves of feeling very open to immigration. And I think it's being open to immigration and actually taking an active role in it goes hand in hand. And if we want to grow our way out of this existential debt crisis, that's the kind of thing that it's going to take. And if you want your grandkids to have a better life than you or an equal life to you, then that's the investment that it's going to take. And all of those things that boomers complain about. I mean, you probably know some of them, but and that was one of my first thoughts with creating this book, is I just had that thought in my head of, my goodness, basically everything, every complaint boomers have about these next generations are things that immigrants do have. And it's funny because it's a lot of these same boomers who are anti-immigration who complain about Americans not having the exact qualities that immigrants bring. And there's no reason, there are, 9 billion people in the world, something like that? There's no reason for us not to be selective. We can't take half the world would be happy to come to America. We can't take 4.5 billion people. So who do we take? We don't need to make it a lottery. We can select for who we want on Team America. We're team captain, and we get to basically select from, still at this point, and this might change. And I want to do this before this does change. But right now, we have our pick. This is the country people still want to come to the most.
Yeah. There's not mass legal or illegal immigration to Russia or South Korea, or Japan doesn't even allow immigration. I mean, people still know that there's a path to freedom, whether that's financial or political, here. I think you're right that we are going down the path of that maybe not being the way. Have you ever heard the story about why so many Vietnamese families are entrepreneurial and or own nail salons?
It's funny because I was just talking about this and I could not remember. It was a celebrity, right?
Yeah, it was like somebody's celebrity wife who basically adopted a bunch of, culturally adopted a bunch of Vietnamese immigrants, and the women were just super impressed by her nails.
Yeah.
So she sent a bunch of them to beautician school, and then one of those gals went out on her own and bought the beauty school that she had gone to, and then invited all of the other female Vietnamese immigrants there, and it just became this cultural thing where it's like, you can own your own business, you can make your own future, you can work in beauty, and it's just been instilled in that culture of now you are entrepreneurial, and the best way to make your way is to own your own business.
Yeah. I mean, same thing with, and I don't know the backstory of the first person that did it, but you get this kind of path dependence where old immigrants assimilate new immigrants and show them, here's a way that you can make a living, make a life for yourself. And so you have Cambodians own, I don't know if it's still true, but 80% of donut shops in California.
Yeah.
they're like 1% of the population. And it's just like it's a funny thing. And I use that a lot as an example of when people try to say that equity demands that, every percent of every race be reflected in every industry. So if only 6% of pilots are black, but blacks are 13% of the population, that equals racism. But it's just such a silly thing because there is like cultural path dependence and things that are not necessarily worse or better. It's not necessarily like bagel shop versus donut shop.
Right. Nurse versus pilot.
Yeah, it's not necessarily that they're frozen out of good industries. It's just you're picking one industry and you're saying this has a disproportionate number of these people. But I guarantee you it is not discrimination against white people in the pastry world that makes it so that Cambodians own 80% of donut shops. It just happens that way, and we shouldn't expect it to happen any other way. It'd be silly to expect it to line up exactly like that. It's just as silly as if, I don't know, you used any other immutable characteristic and said like this is due to, I'm sure you would find left-handed discrepancies or green-eyed discrepancies in certain industries, and it doesn't mean anything. That's just how things happen.
Right. What are the questions I'm forgetting to ask you about the book since I haven't got to dive into it yet?
I think mainly, if I could sum up the nationalism portion of it, I would just say that it's good to love your country, and it's good to feel like you have something that's worth fighting for. We have been systematically disassembled by the left when it comes to truth, basic truths about biology, and you can even see it reflected in their language, my truth versus the truth. This idea that there is no objective truth, there's only stories, there's only my truth, there's only people's experiences. All of these things kind of work together to create this post-truth world that nobody can thrive in. And you just have no connection to your community. Everything it's nihilism in a way. And I think nobody is going to end up fighting for America or for American values, or even the values that are good that the left claims to espouse. Nobody's going to find those worth fighting for if you totally deconstruct this country and this culture and the ideals that it is founded on. And that doesn't mean that we've always been perfect. But if you want a relationship to work, you don't just focus constantly on the things that are imperfect. You especially don't focus on the things that are imperfect that have nothing to do with you. I mean, if my wife decided that instead of focusing on the good things about me, she was going to focus on mistakes that I made in past relationships before we were even together and harp on those all the time and say, you say you're a good person, but in 1999, you had this girlfriend that you treated poorly and you did X, Y, and Z, and that's who you are, and that's what you're built on. That relationship's not going to work. But that is what people do. People will take things that have nothing to do with them and say, America is evil presently because X, Y, or Z happened in 1834. Or it's an insane tact to take if you want a healthy relationship with the place that you live. And you can do it to any country. If you don't want a healthy relationship with the place that you live, I don't know what to tell you except maybe go somewhere else. Go find a place you do want to have a healthy relationship, because I think most of us are frankly sick and tired of the bitching and moaning about things that we don't control and they don't control and we can't change and they can't change. And instead of focusing on a healthy commonality and common purpose and American project to go into the future that we can all agree on and we can all work toward and we can all love together and nurture together and cherish, without that substrate there, this isn't going to be a viable place to live and to thrive 2 generations from now. And I do kind of think we're that close where if we kept going down this same path, that is where we would end up. And thankfully, I do really think when I started writing this book, I didn't see the tide turning. But I think thankfully you do see that now. And you see, gosh, I mean, even just with the vibe of Donald Trump, love him or hate him, I think you see a lot of people that are just appreciating the wanting to be winners, to stop being losers. His speech to Congress was about winning, overwhelmingly positive. And whether he gets it done or not, it's the striving that is going to be important. And in my opinion, it's probably going to, it's going to take a few presidents, and we're going to need some people who are real builders and who are maybe, less divisive. But I think it's not the worst start that we could have. And I think it's better than the alternative, which, like I said before, was just a managed decline. We're just, hoping to, we're not paying our mortgage anymore, and we're just, hoping we can get enough moratoriums on eviction because of whatever that we can get until, before our grandkids are kicked out of this house that we've built.
Do you think it's possible to get past the divisive issue? Because until about 10 minutes ago, Elon was a darling of the left, right? When he was building green energy and cool electric cars and solar panels and saying all the right things and staying out of politics. I mean, he was absolutely the darling of the left, right? There's that famous scene of Trump going on The View like 8 years ago or 9 years ago, 10 years ago, going on Oprah 10 years ago, and they're just fawning all over him, right? Like, oh, I just want to be in proximity to this other billionaire, and he's so charismatic, and he hangs out with a lot of hot women, right? And he's like the bad boy that nobody likes to like. But then as soon as there's a shift politically, and you can call it red pill, you can call it conservatism, you can call it fake if you want to, I don't really care. It's all of a sudden, Elon is a Nazi oligarch who is not doing this out of the goodness of his heart. It's all about him trying to sell Tesla trucks to the military and sneak in Starlink contracts to the. It's like he already had all those things, right? You make the best product, you're going to win. The government might want to buy some of them. So I don't know if we can get past that divisiveness, or if the right, I'll call it conservatives, lowercase c, not Republicans, if they can hold together a coalition of one issue voters that think like this so that they can have 51% of the votes in perpetuity for a generation to kind of shift the tide. I just don't know if it's possible to get past that divisiveness. Like, when I think of people that have known me for 15 years, where it's like, hey, Dave, I think you have a different political opinion. I think you're wrong. And he's like, well, I think you're a Nazi. It's like that there's no level, like that guy will never refer me a deal. I will never refer him a deal. He would never say that to me in person because I would punch his fucking lights out. But it's like, this is now the environment we live in. I don't know if it's possible to get past that.
Not only do I think it is possible, I think it is already happening. And I think those people are deleting relationships into a smaller and smaller and smaller bubble. The people I know who are like that are protecting themselves from reality more and more by only allowing people in a little echo chamber to talk to them. And those echo chambers are getting smaller and smaller. Yes, a lot of those echo chambers still have funding for national cable shows and for things like that. But you even see Joy Reid got fired. You're seeing the most extreme are being cold a little bit on that side. And the people who demand that it be that divisive and demand it be that way, they are creating smaller and smaller ecosystems for themselves. And I think it's only a matter of time. There will be holdouts. There will be people who are still like that. But those people are going to be like those Japanese soldiers that they found 20 years after World War II had ended on some island hiding in a cave who didn't know the war was over. They're going to be fighting a war in their own minds while hiding in a little cave while the rest of us just move on.
Yeah. I saw I'm sure it was an Instagram reel or something, but it really got me thinking the last holdouts will be the ultra progressives who did something to their kids.
Yeah.
Because there is no level of self-reflection I could do that would get me past a theory that maybe hurt my kids. And that might be the theory of you put your kids in crippling debt for the rest of their life because you're like, well, the only path to success is USC for undergrad and then try to get into Harvard for graduate and I see this all the time on loan applications.
Yeah.
$300,000 in debt and they make $75,000 a year. And if we go this direction of meritocracy where it's like, yeah, the government's just not writing free checks anymore to pay off the debt that you assumed, I think those parents will forever feel guilty when in their subconscious, they're like, oh yeah, my kid was always going to be a public school teacher, probably could have gone to Cal State LA. But like I had this dream of having a Harvard educated kid. So now we're massively in debt. Or you can go even further with the COVID vaccine or the trans issue or whatnot. Like, yeah. I think there will be a large holdout of loud people who will not be able to cross the Rubicon of their own decisions because it affected their kids negatively.
I think on some of those, you're right. Like on the trans issue, if you fought for your kid to get surgeries and therapies that are irreversible and your kid ends up regretting it. Yeah, I think those people are going to, for the most part, hold out. I think a lot of those other things, though, parents are going to be able to offload personal responsibility and blame the government. And sometimes they'll be right. I don't blame my parents for carving me up when I was a kid with pasta and bread all the time because that's what the government said was the healthy thing to do. And they've moved on from that. I've moved on from that. I don't think there's a lot of blame in something like that where you can say, I was lied to. I did my best, but I was lied to. I think, though, some of the people who maybe let their kids transition, but the kid spearheaded it, or they were convinced by a doctor. Somebody who goes to a doctor who says, would you rather have a dead daughter or a living son? I think even when they made the wrong decision, I think some of those people will be able to forgive themselves and blame the authorities they trusted, and maybe some extent blame themselves for trusting authority. But realistically, I think there's a lot of parents who really got duped into that, and they'll have to admit that they were duped, but that's not nearly as bad as the parents you see who are pushing their kids, to the people with the trans 2-year-olds who are pushing their kids to be trans so that they can have some sort of social currency. Those people will never let go.
I hope you're right that the echo chamber is getting smaller and smaller because I'm not as
don't you see that? I see that in people that I know who just keep making their circle smaller and smaller and less diverse ideologically because they can't handle any outside criticism. And they're also making themselves vulnerable to any argument because they never hear the counter argument. They spin themselves into an opinion without ever hearing any opposition.
Yeah.
And they are so weak that they're not going to be able to even have that conversation. Yeah, sure, they'll like just say, oh, I don't talk to racists, or I don't talk to fascists, or I don't talk to people who are propagandized by Putin. You know, they'll have all these excuse lines, but they're going to more and more and more just be talking to themselves.
We can only
like the drugged out people on my streets of LA. They are going to be just that person on the corner kind of shifting back and forth and muttering things to themselves because they won't be able to have a real conversation with anybody who disagrees with them in any way, shape, or form.
Yeah, I hope you're correct. And I think in 100 years, when we do the postmortem on this time of history, I do think, and this is a very weird thing to go to, it'd be very easy to people to dismiss this as like, oh, this is just Scott's bro culture talking. I do think Elon Musk buying Twitter is going to go down as a pivotal moment in American history, not just because free speech was at risk and Elon's going to hopefully help cut funding in the government. It's made him a political ally now to the right because of this Twitter thing. But more importantly, I think it gave corporate America cover to be like, oh, well, Twitter was supposed to fail. He was supposed to fire these 18,000 employees and everything was going to go away and X wasn't going to exist and you weren't going to be able to post on it. And how can a company possibly get along without 7 DEI directors? And then about a year and a half later, Mark Zuckerberg goes on Rogan and he sounds like the most libertarian jujitsu bro I've ever talked to, where he's like, well, we're going to get rid of this like free speech limitation and we're going to do this. And I'm hunting a lot. And I'm just like, wait, what? Like the poster boy for beta male liberals, which leads me to believe he was probably just faking it the whole time because that's what he needed to do to grow the company. Or maybe he's faking it now. I don't know. But it's at least giving cover to some of these tech bros and bigger companies. And now, you know, I turn on the All In podcast and it's people who I would have absolutely expected to be parroting every left-wing talking point even 5 years ago, definitely 10 years ago. And now they're like, oh no, more free markets, more free speech, more this, you know, more legal immigration. I'm like, this is not what I'm used to hearing. So I guess that does give me pause or hope that, yeah, the echo chamber that you and I would disagree with is shrinking and shrinking.
Yeah, and I think Zuckerberg's main problem was just that he was weak. I think he probably always believed the things that he is saying now, and I think he did not have a spine to stand up for it. I think he saw a lot of the same with Jack Dorsey. I am very confident that Jack Dorsey, former CEO of Twitter, as soon as he got a board that wanted all of these things, he just couldn't find a way to stand up to them and keep his platform that he created a free place. And you saw little gasps of this on his Twitter. He would just sometimes randomly post here's libertarian anarchist Murray Rothbard, read this. Or
Right.
He would tweet these links to things where you're like, this is the exact opposite of everything that Twitter says that they're for right now. And I think you're going to have just a lot of those followers. The vibe of the country is shifting. And I think you have a very small percentage on each side who are strong enough to fully stand up for their convictions against a huge crowd, a mob trying to tear them apart. Probably 80% of the country is just going to drift along with the vibe of the country. So I think that's the turn you're going to see, and we'll see how long that lasts. But
you mentioned Zuckerberg being spineless, which I think there's a lot of spineless Americans. There was a throwaway line in that podcast that hit me so hard. And this is why I'm okay with Trump or Kash Patel or Tulsi Gabbard or RFK or Elon Musk or anybody taking an axe to the current government infrastructure, because I think a lot of the government, call it the deep state, call it unelected bureaucracy, whatever, has been in cahoots with the side of the argument that you and I would disagree with, because there was this one throwaway line that Zuckerberg said, and if you don't work in mortgage or finance, you wouldn't know what the fuck he was talking about. He was like, yeah, Joe, at one point when we had a disagreement with the government, Elizabeth Warren stepped in and said, well, we're going to have the CFPB investigate you. And for those of you guys that don't know, the CFPB is the Consumer Financial Protection Board. This is the entity that licenses mortgage professionals. This is the entity that is the checks and balances on the credit card companies so they're not doing something unethical or illegal or predatory. They have absolutely nothing to do with social media, period, the end. Facebook is not a banking platform. You don't have to be regulated. You don't have to have a license. You're not a financial investor or a financial analyst or advisor who has to have a Series 7. The CFPB has nothing. What the CFPB does have is they have issued the largest fines in America against companies, right? So Wells Fargo, for example, and I don't even blame them although I like to talk shit about Wells Fargo. Wells Fargo had some computer coding issue where this fee that wasn't supposed to be charged to veterans was being charged to veterans on a bunch of loans. It was a nominal fee. This wasn't Wells Fargo wanting to be evil and screw over veterans. It was literally a programming error, and it just went on in perpetuity, and a bunch of veterans paid a couple extra $1,000s to buy a house. Literally a rounding error. Somebody found that at the CFPB, and they fined Wells Fargo $100 million. So the CFPB has this huge fining and levying power. And Elizabeth Warren knew that, where she went after Facebook and said, hey, if you don't play ball, we're going to have the CFPB investigate you. And I'm sure it would go something like this. PayPal links are being exchanged in your Facebook Messenger. That therefore makes you a banking institution.
Right.
We're now going to fine you out of existence because you didn't play ball on this social issue. So I'm kind of sympathetic to spineless or even non-principled CEOs, because when the power of the government comes after you, and Facebook's one of the biggest companies in the world, imagine a smaller company where all of a sudden they're like, oh, hey, if you don't want to play ball on this social issue, we'll just find a way to fine you out of existence with the CFPB or the SEC or something like that. It's it made me actually feel sorry for Zuckerberg, which is crazy for me to feel sorry for a billionaire. But I wish Joe Rogan would have had the knowledge to dig into that a little bit more, because I think that would have been a great part of the interview.
Yeah, there's some competing things there too, where you do have a fiduciary duty to your investors as well. So are you going to go against your ideals of free speech, or are you going to screw over your investors? That is a choice. But I think, a lot of these people who espoused these ideals, because Zuckerberg did before Rogan, before at the beginning of Facebook, Zuckerberg was very much in the same place that he is now. And it's just that he bent to pressure in the meantime. And so, sure, he had to choose between staying true to his values or maybe it would have even been illegal for him. Maybe it would have been a violation. It would have been considered a violation of fiduciary duty for him to stand true to who he was. But yeah, what's legal isn't always right. We can't just say, well, Rosa Parks broke the law.
Right.
Law's the law. Sometimes you have a responsibility that might be competing with a whole lot of other things to just do the right thing anyway.
Yeah.
And maybe you have to take the consequences. And that's the whole idea of civil disobedience, right? People like to think now that they're being civilly disobedient if they do something that's illegal for their own principles, and they think that means that they shouldn't have any consequences. And the guy that invented civil disobedience, that wrote civil disobedience, was a tax resistor during war, and he would get angry that people would bail him out of jail because, and this is Martin Luther King too, like the consequences are the point. You want to show the machine for what it is. So the really strong thing for Zuckerberg to have done would have been to stand up for free speech and to show the machine for what it is. And then maybe take it to the Supreme Court on free speech grounds that this is government interfering with free speech.
Yeah.
I know I've kind of weaved in and out, but I would say I think the book is worth reading, especially if you consider yourself to be on the right, because there is kind of this schism right now happening. And I don't align myself with Republicans or Democrats or Libertarians because I always want to have the freedom to call issues as I see them and never have to feel like I'm defending some group or some single politician or some person. But I do consider this book in some ways to be a little bit of a love letter to the Make America Great Again crowd, because I think a lot of the principles that they stand for and the problems that they've diagnosed are correct. And I would love it if, with an open mind, they would consider that a lot of those things that are really important to them could be solved with a really sensible immigration policy, and that having a sensible immigration policy is the single best way to make America great again.
That's the way to end the podcast, man. Thanks.